Merci beaucoup, Jean-Marc, Eve Catin, Philippe, Radi et toutes les autres personnes impliquées dans cet événement. I am deeply honored to be here, and I must apologize that I cannot speak French, so I will try to be as clear as possible and hope that I can bring some contribution here. My talk will try to engage three elements. I will probably spend a bit more time on the first and the third, even if the second is the most important. But as an introduction, I just want to briefly begin with, my flight here yesterday, where I read that for 2023, the word of the year turns out to be authentic. Authentic is the highest volume of lookups and so on. So this sort of word cloud tells us, a word cloud is a kind of data visualization of the most prevalent text in some kind of field, that collectively people seem to be concerned a little bit about or aspiring to or judging things by this concept of authenticity. What is authentic? Perhaps it is that which is not fake, that which does not imitate, somehow real, true, accurate, and so on, maybe true to personality, but also to fact. The article went on to speculate why, and then claimed possibly that with the rise of AI, deepfake videos, and so on and so forth, we have now moved into a kind of nostalgia for truth. And the third most looked up word to verify that was, in fact, deepfake. So our word cloud is telling us something about a current anthropological moment that is highly relevant to our subject today. I want to just begin with an anecdote where the last time I spoke about post-truth and so on was when we were all a little bit surprised and panicked during the Trump years, and how the media ecosystem might have produced that. And I was in a conversation with two academics. The one was a realist philosopher. The other was a mathematician professor and a hedge fund manager who had just written a book called Weapons of Destruction, of mathematical destruction. And it was very interesting. This was the moment where fake news was sort of uncovered for the first time. And then, Pizzagate, Hillary Clinton is a pedophile, etc., this kind of thing. And quickly, that term was optimized within search by Trump himself. That story circulated more than any other story on the eve of the election. And so that was an interesting problem of the news ecosphere. That very quickly, the word fake news was itself then appropriated by Trump, and things became extremely sort of confusing. So there was a sort of a search engine optimization in reverse, and the next thing we were driven into a kind of what one might call algorithmically driven relativism. And so the philosopher more or less claimed, he was a realist philosopher in his manifesto on realism, that, let's see if I could get this to work, too much work, that we needed something like realist philosophy as a bulwark against the overwhelming postmodern turn where facts were considered as sort of inherently theory-laden. Think of Derrida and so on and so forth, spheres of the undecidable, experience, difference as a kind of differential structure of our hold on presence and truth. And that this was seen at the time, of course, as somehow progressive. And the realists are trying to put a bulwark against that, advancing in some sense two things: unamendable physical facts. The natural world is unamendable in some way. If a rock falls on it, roof falls on my head, this is a fact. We don't interpret it. Well, we do. We could say it's fate. We could say it's bad building standards, and we could do all sorts of things, but a rock is a rock. And was basically saying we need this sort of irrevocability of, on the one hand, unamendability, and on the other hand, documentality, which is that historical social facts too are built into documents, institutions, etc., and have the same kind of character. We need to take that seriously. And we see Delanda and assemblage theory, network theory, removing from the humanities the human to some extent, and saying non-human agents matter, and actually kind of matter more. Anthropocene arguments help this along. The mathematician, in contrast, was arguing that all the algorithms out there, particularly those that predict recidivism, creditworthiness, and so on, higher insurance rates and such out of individuals, were all in some sense violent systems that were deeply biased. and they had codified into their workings a kind of prejudice. So there's a few things to notice here, is that there's a sort of distrust on the one hand from the mathematician of her own discipline, and a distrust on the humanities of his own discipline, and they kind of switch roles as if to compensate for the shortcomings of the other. And I thought this was deeply fascinating and perhaps symptomatic, because as it turns out, the mathematician was calling for more human intervention, that she was arguing that there was haphazard data gathering, spurious correlations, which are often correlated to causations, confirmation biases, etc., and that what was needed was, in fact, some additional human engagement, right? And when Google gets involved with its search engine problems, very often these are human editors doing the adjusting, right? Post facto, the machine can't handle it alone, and so on. So calling for more of the human, and in the other case, when rocks and so on impose themselves unbidden onto the human, the humanities philosophers and theorists increasingly turn to this kind of materialist realism, right? This is a fascinating, to me, symptom, and I wondered whether this was in fact useful for us right now, that there was this kind of switch and bait move happening that seemed to me quite symptomatic. And the unamendability of the real world struck me already as a kind of naive move. So let us take the other great sort of figure of the false at the time in the United States, which is the figure of Mike Pence. And I'll give you a brief foray into the kind of reasoning that he brought to the table, where Trump was just anything, fake, anything goes. Pence sort of offered a kind of intellectual apparatus for it. And in his defense, for example, of evolution, of teaching intelligent design with evolution in schools, he argued in a very interesting way. He said that what we need is more free speech and more sort of genuine encounter in a kind of academic free environment, and we need to introduce intelligent design. He said it like this. He begins by saying, evolution is a very interesting theory, and we need to teach it, right? So it's a humble humility, kind of healthy skeptic, etc. We need to teach it, but we need to teach it as a theory. Why as a theory? I channel the personality a little bit. Why as a theory? Because if you see they discovered some kind of new Homo australopithecus or what have you in Morocco or in South Africa or whatever he had referring to at the time, and said, now we need to redate the figure of man from this to this by readjust it by 2 million years. In other words, it's a soft thing going on here, and we need to sort of adjust it according to this. So what he learned as a fact as a kid is no longer what we learn as a fact as kids today. And as a result, this is a mere theory. It is a good theory, interesting, but it is a mere theory. And then he, again, in fake sort of skepticism and humility, says, I too have a theory. I don't know if it's correct, but I think we should put it into the school so it can be in a healthy debate, a real debate. And this theory is intelligent to design, that the origin of man is God-given and so on and so forth. And he thinks that when properly debated, it will win the debate eventually, but it should be put into the machinery. Right. And so his theory versus that theory. Now we've gone what I think completely Deleuzian. In other words, everything is on a plane of consistency, because of the laundering of logic here is clear. On the one hand, it's a sort of demotion of science to theory. Fair enough. We can go with that so far. But it's a promotion of a belief to theory. Now we have a problem, because something like cholera or COVID doesn't care if you think it's a theory or not. It is a sort of imposing something that we need to deal with, and then we trial and error, and that revision of the evolution is in fact the productive revision, because it's in a frictionful relationship to this thing called reality. This is where immediately the philosopher, or at least the naive realists, fall short, because it's precisely the amendability that proves that you might be more likely to be in the world of fact. So unamendability is not so easy. And in fact, the unamendable thing in that scenario is precisely the intelligent design. And why is that? Because intelligent design has no friction against which it can be pushed back. If you say if you say the world is designed by God and so on and so forth, it will always be true. And this is the old antinomy. Deepest relativism produces resolution often in the god or in an emperor or some kind of what Nietzsche would call, the most ancient metaphor. So the cohabitation here of relativism with the most powerful fundamentalism is something that we need to reckon with. It's a dialectical sort of conundrum. And it's in this sort of reversal that I thought the realists are really not helping us to cope with the proliferation, or at least the anthropological reality that there is a proliferation of disinformation, of the false and so on, or that it is on the rise. And neither do I think the mathematician, for reasons that will become clearer in the final part of what I address you today with. So much for the kind of theoretical conundrum that is with us today, the sort of materialist turn of the humanities and the kind of humanist turn of the skeptical mathematicians, of the progressive, useful mathematicians, right? But the question, I think, of big data and so on requires a certain kind of specificity that is not managed by either of these positions. And this sort of discipline switching is not useful because in some ways, fake news is true data to begin with, right? And so we have levels of what we are talking about here where we, a true data, a data measures it is an equal object for Graham Harman, even if it freights fake news. So we need to be doing something quite different, right? What exactly is the ontology or the philosophical status of an algorithm? What is an algorithm, or what is the status of a data point that then in its pulverized form gets reconstellated and modeled into, other forms of entities, right? So this quasi-informatic kind of data set that then become subject to computational modeling. And how does that interact with the social layer, machinic and the social, the sort of parallax universe of HTML and HTTP behind the screen and then the social surface where we touch a screen that is looking just to be touched, right? Waiting to be engaged with and so on. And so what I want to argue is that there are certain systematic processes, and I want to identify three very particular ones that in some sense are the conditions for the possibility of the emergence of contemporary manifestations of the false, right? The first I want to say is a legal constraint. The second, an economic sort of system of financial imperatives, or we might say, disincentives and incentives. And the third would be how technical protocols work on their own, right? So a legal question, an economic question, the most important, the one I'll do least with because much work has been done. And the third, a technical question, which takes me a little bit down the road. This is the machine bias kind of quotation. The truth is they are only purely algorithmic processes that can, no algorithmic processes can infer truth from lies and so on. And do we need the intervention of the human subject? That takes me to some sort of boring history here, but I want to start with the era of broadcast media. So as we enter this era, so remember, fake news exists forever, right? The yellow journalism, 1890s, etc., which arguably had something to do with the outcome of the Spanish-American War. This is already there. But let's move into the moment of technical media that are to some extent, electronic and to some extent modern, right? The media we still use. So this is radio. And in radio, we find a real question, and I'm being a bit schematic here about a very deep history, about what is the meaning of this medium? Like, what kind of medium is this? Is it the press? Is it an entertainment device? Is it like a telephone or a telegraph? Because there was still DXing back and forth. Because all of these things have different legal implications. If it's the press, it needs First Amendment protections. For example, America, I'm being America-centric, but for a reason that might be helpful, I'll occasionally make the contrast with places like Canada. But telephone, telegraph would have a different legal understanding, which is what we call common carriage, right? If you have a cheap telephone or an expensive one because it's made of ivory or something, you get the same signal that passes through the wires, and that is called common carriage, right? It's sort of equal access requirement. Taxpayer money built the phone line, so therefore we all get the same signal, even if our own device looks better or more sexy or something. That is a part of the legal construal. Radio, it turns out, does not take on the telephonic definition, but rather is eventually construed as a scarce medium because of certain moments. The Radio Act in 1912 kicked Congress into action because of the sinking of the Titanic. Sometimes these things capture the imagination of our lawmakers. That was because all sorts of false signals were interfering, and you needed the Navy to have very clear channels, as it were, to offer precise and accurate information. This was already challenged in 1926 because from 1920 to by the end, that decade in the 20s was the same decade as the 90s was for the PC. Really, vacuum tubes and crystal sets, etc., moved into the household, and you now have a loudspeaker and so on, which was seen as better than your headphones, and it becomes a kind of mass phenomenon. And by the mid-20s, a company called Zenith simply took over a Navy line. And Hoover, who was at the time the Secretary of Commerce, had a kind of philosophy of associationalism, free markets, etc., and overlooked it. And this sort of kicked, the Department of Commerce into action, and they took them to court. Zenith was using a Navy line, and Zenith won. So it was a kind of privatized ethos. The Navy has no right to have this sort of spectrum, etc., which then jolted a new formation in Congress called the Federal Radio Commission. This is now 1927. And the Federal Radio Commission was meant to regulate how radio was to be used. And it later became the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates internet, etc., right? And what happened there was that they decided that radio was the scarce spectrum. You needed a license. It belonged to the public. It was a public resource with scarcity. And as a result, you had to apply for a license. And on the model of trusteeship, you had to do something in return. You could have it if your name was, NBC in that case. There was one initially, a lot of mergers and so on. If your name was NBC, you could have that, but you needed to answer to the interest, convenience, and necessity of the community that you are serving, right? So this Radio Act of 1927 began to understand the spectrum as a privilege, not a right. You needed to be licensed. There was a model of trusteeship, and you had to do something, answer to the interest, convenience, and necessity. And then by 1934, a new provision about localism and diversity also entered into the legislation, which is still there today. Broadcast media, interest, convenience, necessity. What does that mean in practice? It means many things, but for our purposes, it meant something quite important, which was that there was a prohibition on certain kinds of speech. And that prohibition was obscene, indecent, profane language, and so on, as we might expect, and also on anything that was fake news, made up stuff. So we find people like John Brinkley, Bob Schuller, Charles Coughlin, more famously, taken off the air, right? So John Brinkley is taken off a very, very popular channel. He had the crazy idea. He was a quack doctor. If you insert goat glands into your scrotum and so on, it will save you from impotence and this kind of thing. Dangerous. He was taken off the air. Same with Bob Schuller. He was, he inveighed against prostitution, alcoholism, and so on and so forth, but then blamed Catholics and Jews for the problem. And then they said, take him off, too dangerous. Charles Coughlin, too, overt supporter of the Nazi party, etc., taken off. And then immediately, here's the thing, taken off. We need to notice that not them only were taken off, which is a broadcast, if you wanted to be on a public broadcast that was scarce, you needed to do something that was accurate. But so too were vegetarian advocates, birth control advocates, Mormons, ACLU, trade unions, lynching opponents, sexual hygiene advocates, and so on. So we see what happens once it's legislated in terms of content. We immediately have a certain sort of a public versus private clash, which is historically how this gets played out. The freedom to speak on the one hand, and then the harm done by certain kinds of speech, public harms. And this is where the state is meant to intervene and so on. And so there's a sort of paradoxical logic immediately. Charles Coughlin, as soon as he was taken off, was said, yeah, all these Jews that control the media, etc., threw me off. And, And what happens is that a paradoxical logic launches itself in that moment. And it's a logic of what we might call the slippery slope of liberalism, right? A dialectic of free speech, that what you are saying might have some cipher of truth because the tyrant there cannot tolerate it, right? And this is always dangerous. When the Dixie Chicks were taken off the air by like George Bush, they immediately, you know, became a cipher of like authenticity in New York and all these kinds of places. Their sales did not go down, they went up by being censored and so on. And so as a result, the kind of move after this period, the 1920s and so on and so forth, was to move increasingly into a kind of more and more speech being permitted. So initially editorials were not permitted. Then the fairness doctrine is passed in the 1940s. There's this deep fear about the use of radio in Nazi Germany, and there's a sort of an opening and a liberalization that you may editorialize so long as you offer a counterpoint and so on, right? That was the fairness doctrine. By the end of that century, late 80s, the fairness doctrine is eroded, and a few years later we have Fox News and so on. And so it's had its vexed history, and it's an ongoing history. But as a sort of debate, it's a question of free speech, the dialectics of free speech. And I mean, I'll just go to the fourth point here, which is there's a basic fundamental sort of debate here between what we might call a liberal, secular, democratic view and a utopian religious view. The utopian religious view holds that the harm done by an offensive false image is so overwhelming that it needs to be removed from the public eye, that it is too dangerous to behold an artifact of false witness, a golden calf, etc., right? And it takes on certain characteristics that are in some ways utopian. Some things are just too dangerous. The liberal, secular, democratic view argues, in contrast, that in the context of fake something or offensive imagery or representations, you offer a counter representation that is meant to be then, through proper empirical evidence, handed to the demos who witnesses a debate and thereby comes to the better conclusion because you trust the people to do the work. This is democratic. Right? And so Chomsky, for example, the Faurisson affair in 1980 was a classic case. He's defending a Holocaust denier in France, right? In the name, he said, after reading Voltaire, he cannot believe that we still do this kind of thing in France and Germany and so on, right? That the free speech thing is a safer ground to move. Otherwise, who gets to decide what is in the interest, convenience, and necessity by law, or what is true, what is false, and so on, and who gets to behold all of that transgression and so on. So this is the sort of problem of free speech as a dialectic, right? Which haunts, of course, all of these media in their technical understanding. Fast forward to the mid-century. By 1950, there is the exemption made to those who unknowingly transmit fake news, if you are a distributor of some sort or a bookseller and so on. And there's a case in the mid-50s that actually tweaked that a little bit, Smith versus California in 1959, where a bookseller, some of his protections fell away because the claim was he knowingly sold books that freighted obscene or fake information, right? But by 1990, we have a new moment of great definition, just as we had in the 20s, literally to the day. 6 years pass by and Congress is jolted into action and offers, in the middle of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, two senators, Chris Cox and Ron Wyden, one from each party, which is important because that's why it's such a capacious stability, because both parties tend to call on the fact that there's harmful information and that they need free speech at different times. So it's in their interests in some ways. They've never disagreed about it. So it's an interesting, point. But it says this in section 230, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So the debate was, what is the meaning? What is the legal definition of the technical device called the internet, or this technical thing called the internet? Came out of ARPANET, nuclear, averting nuclear attacks, etc. So it's also publicly funded, but it is now moved into private use at the end of the Cold War and so on. How does this come to be defined? Is it a bookseller? Is it a printing press? Is it a telephone? Is it a radio? Is it a television? What is it? And that kind of question swirled around, that the technical sort of nature of the internet lacked legal specificity. And it was decided in this moment with a small phrase in Section 5 of Telecommunications Act, the Communications Decency Act, that it would be a telephone. The internet is a telephone, right? And potentially for the rather sort of haphazard fact that it was built on the old telephone lines, which were public money. But it was not construed as scarce like the radio. It was much more telephonic. So it became telecommunications with platforms. So when Twitter throws Trump off, okay, this is not because he has no access to a broadcast medium, but because what was the CEO's name at the time, the one before Musk? Put the phone down. You're entitled to put the phone down at any time. You're also entitled to say whatever you want. So it's a sort of new and very different medium to the broadcast media. And gone were all of those protections about interest, convenience, and necessity, for better or for worse, right? And there's a bit of a prehistory here, and I just want to walk you briefly through some of the main court cases, which is Smith versus California. I mentioned was the one that was first drawn on when this became when this became an issue, which was the one where you don't always have protections as a bookseller or a printer if you knowingly somehow sell illegal content or harmful content or lies or obscene stuff and so on, right? You were no longer then a neutral intermediary. Your knowingness, your knowledge of, your intent to some extent demonstrated editorial control, and therefore you were liable. That's what happened in 1959. Now, the early internet, as I certainly remember, but was was characterized by newsletters, bulletin boards, chat rooms, this kind of thing. And there were three primary service providers: CompuServe, Prodigy, and America Online. And all three of them were quickly implicated in lawsuits that then eventually established a precedent by 1997, right? The first one is interesting because it was Cubby versus CompuServe. That's the one in 1999. They were hosting, so CompuServe is the provider, is hosting something called Rumorville, which is a newsletter, which had made libelous claims towards a guy called Bob Blanchard at Computer Products Company. And the libel was, it was ruled in favor of CompuServe because you could not expect with such a quick medium that they could have editorial oversight over everything that was being mounted daily on something called Rumorville. And it was called Rumorville, so again, it had a sort of claim to being not quite true anyway, right? But you couldn't, said the court, expect that a service provider, which is a kind of technical operation, could navigate all of that editorial control over content in real time. So it fell sort of in step with Smith versus California, although the verdict was on the other side, right? Which is to say that it's a kind of conduit theory of media. And remember, the word was now platform. Platform means like a feminine technology. I only hold things for you, like a Heideggerian jug, neutral, etc. Versus the idea that you are actually cooking it up like a casserole and changing things, right? This would be the other one, which is in some sense become in the direction of public publishing, right? That being said, by 1995, Stratton Oakmont versus Prodigy, that's a securities brokerage firm versus one of the other service providers, on a platform now, or a bulletin board, as they were called Money Talk, had in some sense made inflammatory posts about Stratton Oakmont, and it turned out that too was taken and escalated up to the court of the Supreme Court, and it did not follow the Smith ruling for the first time. Why? Because they argued that Prodigy had in fact cast editorial oversight over what could be posted here in Money Talk. They were trying to keep it accurate, And as a result, they demonstrated, the board leaders, as they were called, intent to somehow change and a conscious choice to somehow change and moderate that content. So by demonstrating content to moderate the fake, they were punished for it, right? And as a result, we have this conundrum facing Congress. The law is doing exactly the opposite of what it's hoping to do. Where you do moderate and try to alleviate the sort of intensity of fake news, you get punished, and vice versa. You get rewarded if you just turn a blind eye. Where ignorance is bliss, it is folly to be wise. And it is this conundrum that faced that faced Congress when they passed the Telecommunications Act, right? If you scan for content, you are liable. For vituperative content or outright falsehood, you are liable because that constitutes intent, versus if you leave it alone, ignore it, you will be in that safe harbor because you're now a publisher or a printing press or a telephone. That being said, what they did next was interesting because they provided that Section 230, which included both. You had an immunity for liability, regardless of the content posted and regardless of if you tried to moderate it. Right. So this is the Scylla and Charybdis with which they are dealing. And something interesting has happened, and this is why the legislation is not identical in Canada or EU and so on, and certainly not China, Russia, Uganda, etc., where there's much more content moderation from the state or from some body in the state. But is that the interesting thing is that what was once a public-private kind of dialectic has turned into, in the US, a private-private one. In other words, it moved entirely into the sphere of self-governance, right? Private self-governance. It's a sort of, you get to moderate, and no matter how you moderate, no matter how you feed, no matter how you mount your algorithms, you will never be liable for content found on your platform because it is always already neutral, no matter how involved you get in the actual formation of the content. This is sort of where we are now. It was immediately tested after the law was passed, Zirin versus America Online, and has been constantly tested right up to the Supreme Court, right up until this year, right? Famously, Zirin versus America Online. Ken Zirin was a guy who was just living like in Portland. I think he was also a bookseller or something. But AOL had posted on one of their anonymous message boards that that Zirin was, very much in favor of the Oklahoma City bombing. He was glorifying the terrorism and so on. He had merch that was for sale, etc. And then all of this was false, of course, but the address and the name were not false. And so he was inundated with hate calls and love calls and so on, and he knew nothing about it and had, almost no opinion. So he was harassed, in a sense, by this false information. Not only did the Supreme Court say that America Online was not liable, but they didn't even need to remove it, right? So harassment could totally persist, even though they now knew and were told and so on and so forth. That was up to that anonymous user to take it down in the name of free speech. So very quickly, we've reached these test cases, right? Gonzalez YouTube is more recent. It's the one about the terrorist bombings in Paris. Gonzalez taking YouTube or Google or Meta, Alphabet, or taking them to court because they had hosted all of this material that basically was used to organize this terrorist attack in Paris, and Gonzalez was a victim. Again, even with the Supreme Court as it looks in America now, if the Supreme Court now is not going to be triggered by terrorism, they're going to be triggered by nothing. Same outcome. This is not YouTube's problem. It's not YouTube's problem. Okay. Now, again, this is not quite followed in Russia, etc., and certainly not in the EU, where Article 10 has a slightly modified version of things. In 2011 in Canada, I invited you to think about the Crooks versus Newton case, which does recognize a distinction between the passive hosting and knowing distribution. But nevertheless, because of the sort of center of the internet evolution being in the US, this is in some sense a much more global phenomenon than we might like to think. And now where there are two sort of power brokers, right? We have the mega companies in the US and the mega companies in China, and this is really where the action is. The rest are sort of following and trying to adjust. The struggles around the EU now are interesting to watch. Okay, so much for the law. That's how we got there. It's very strange, but there's this immunity clause. Fake news is permitted there and not there. Remember, of course, the difference now, if you consider the difference between, I think, keep forgetting which way, but there's a difference between think about the difference between Tucker Carlson and Fox News versus Alex Jones and Google, right? So YouTube made a lot of money from Alex Jones and paid him quite well for going viral and so on for his fake stuff, you know, claiming that like the shooter at a country music concert is Islamic black guy or whatever. Turns out to have been a white guy, but too late. He got first mover advantage and within 3 hours had millions of views. And the official news was never really watched by those who preferred that thing, you know, externalization of the id. We want to have fed back to us our own desire. It's a fascinating kind of moment. And then compare that to Fox News and Tucker Carlson, where Carlson was not actually sued. It was the company that was sued. So Carlson doesn't get sued, even though de facto the screens that people are watching on are very similar. They're both caught up in a kind of attention economy, right, where you maximize engagement and so on. And sort of economic incentives are rather similar, but you can't go for Google. You can go for Fox News. This is the sort of tension. Similar figures, making stuff up for Tucker Carlson about fake news and everything. And notice how you had to prove his intent, which is also very, very important because this malicious intent is actually a malicious problem in the law, which I'll get to in just a minute. So I was going to just quickly pass, that's the legal story, quickly pass in like 1 minute through the economic story, because the economic story, I mean, there's a lot of work being done on this already, but the idea is that moderation, to some extent, quote unquote, moderation, getting involved with your platform in some editorial way, became deeply profitable in more recent times, right? It is actually how these companies become profitable. The value of information that circulates in these intermediaries is gauged by economics of engagement in real time. It has very little to do, or it is set adrift of, the veracity of that content. The content doesn't really make a difference, right? At all. And given the immunity clause, content moderation and so on, curation, feeds, persuasion techniques, etc., dopamine labs that test people's biological Masumi kind of like reflexes, affects, etc. These auto-suggestion techniques, etc., which is, Google's cascade telling you this is what they think they're thinking. And Google is about to use, it's not far now, use simple GPTs for the first sort of page. So you can read something quite specific and it scans that all for you first. None of this sort of editorial input has decreased or anything like that. It's only increased. And in fact, given that data extraction from users and then provision elsewhere, the user is either the buyer of an ad, so the consumer, or is the product themselves, like if you are providing data. And the more granular, the better, right? Using cookies, scripts, APIs, banners, etc., etc. The company permits itself to, gather personal information, device information, log information, location, local storage data. I mean, I can't list it all. If you read the terms and conditions, usually in one of the appendixes, it's alarming. Basically, entire data sets. The more granular, the better, which means that the weirder you are, the better. So it's not experienced as some sort of surveillant Foucault-like, machine where we adjust because somebody might be being watched. Now we know we're being watched, but we externalize more of our id day by day. Your Google search is deeply important data, and you are not privy to it, right? It is, in fact, in some sense, a two-tiered information system. On the one hand, the chaos of us working with it, and on the other, the gathering of data sets, petabytes of data that then gets sold off to brokers, Experian, Axiom, other data brokering companies, and so on. This seems to me the basic structure. And intention management, or what I call the financialization of arousal, is itself like the name of the game. So the incentives are in some sense driven by more and more editorial involvement, like maneuvering. And at the same time, you are immune from any of that maneuvering, right, by law. Interestingly, when it comes to intellectual property, the opposite is the case. So it's a very fascinating sort of paradox, contradiction really in the law, but we will leave that question just as a sort of provocation, right? Again, just to sort of show this, these are some quotations. Twitter's pull to refresh it feature is like an itch. Lauren Brichter, she designed it. He designed it. Snapchat is like heroin. Justin Rosenstein, he designed it. Facebook likes are like bright dings of pseudo pleasure, etc. And then the last one, actually, we don't allow the iPad in the home. We think it's far too dangerous for the children. That was Steve Jobs himself on, when it came out. So it's the designers fully know what they're doing in order to extract attention. Engagement is everything. The stranger you are, it's a sort of pornification, if you like, or pornucopia, where you get your crazy id actually, if we do a bit of psychoanalysis, actually gets sort of educated, right? I think Hillary Clinton's a pedophile. Put it in, oh, not only is this that, it's worse. And so your super ego, which used to be a social circle going, I don't think so, is now like, yes, but it's much worse than you think. So you get sort of, it's this strange new sort of psychoanalytic terrain, but I'll put it aside, simply noting that for our purposes, there's an incentive in promoting engagement that is indifferent to the question of whether what you are promoting is fake or unfake. Google made a lot of money from Alex Jones and then disavowed him, of course, but that all the risk of being libelous or sued fell onto Alex Jones, right? So the risk is outsourced, but at the same time, the data extraction and the economic incentives are insourced, as it were, or internalized. And that contradiction, I think, is very important. But I can't go into it in much detail. I have a feeling that that is common, a little bit more common. So I just wanted to go somewhere else. The legal thing, Section 230, without it, I think it defines it just like the Cold War defines the era from 1945 to 1990. I feel Section 230 almost does that kind of work for us today. So I just want to switch, though, to another sort of one of the multifactorial prongs when we consider disinformation in a more serious way as a system, not as an object, not about truth and falsity, but about systems that make this kind of flow possible. And that is the sort of more technical one. And here, the notion of bad actors seems to me really problematic with malicious intent, right? Dominion, etc. Like Tucker Carlson knew that he was talking lies, etc., but he didn't own up to it. But I think we need to look at the specificity here of what kind of philosophical object an algorithm here is. It's a bland point, but what kind of mathematical functionality, whether it's mining or modeling or inferring or analyzing or clustering in a Markov chain or generating under decision trees, connectivity models, whether they are centroid, distributed graph-based, etc. They drive all of the features from autocomplete, speech to text, search, text generation, and so on, right? This is the kind of parallax theory I'm talking about, that what happens behind the scene, behind the hood, as it were, is a very different kind of a system of logic gates and voltages that has very little to do with the experience we have as users in front of a screen, right? And what I want to argue more or less, in case I can't finish everything, is that where we can't just say these are biased, I would say that mathematical routines are radically non-biased. They are simply executing a certain kind of matrix or some kind of decisionism based within a kind of modeling system, and that kind of what they produce is in orthogonal relationship to the usual thing we consider bias, which is human inputs, right? Which is human ways in which we select, organize, hierarchize. Remember all the postmodernists and so on. That kind of bias or that kind of tiltedness is not the same as when a mathematical system produces a result, right? Remember that Google, in fact, is a better search engine than Bing or DuckDuckGo, which is less invasive of your data when it comes to fake news and so on. Why? Because of the intervention of the human editors that then sort of said, we need to fix this. We have a problem, right? We need to fix this. And they try to fix it machinically, but very often it's a combination of machine-human oversight. At any rate, algorithmic inferences from patterns in data do not or cannot stand as a proxy in any way for the reality that they appear to represent, right? So we've got this sort of parallax world. It's hanging on its own orthogonal vector that does all this kind of miracle magic work. that I think, we often see things in things that are not there and so on. Okay, so let me go very simply here. This is just a Markov chain that you see there. And to talk about these sorting mechanisms in some sense in the context of something basic like search, right? So search, where in the context of search, it's a almost inverted tree structure. It's a little bit like Hegel in reverse, where the human begins with a sense certainty and then figures out that there's this sort of tree that goes out into the world from there. This is the reverse, the petabytes of tree, and then you invert it and drop it down like dominoes to the single point, which is what you are looking for. So it's a sort of philosophically crazy reversal of that commonplace idea. A sort of abstract relation for a human is now a relational abstraction or something like that. That's a bit not quite right, but something like that, right? And so by mining petabytes of pre-existing linguistic fragments and clustering these statistical connections into letters, words, and phrases, sorting mechanisms such as search, which are automatic, identify through all of the possibilities an optimal selection. But that optimal selection, right, is a commonality that is sorted and ranked by two matrices, column stochastic matrices and transition matrices. So it's kind of graph theory, which register the prevalence and the importance of a page according to certain relationships between lines and edges. So a node, let's say, for example, if a node K has these outgoing edges, it passes 1/k worth of importance to that ranking mechanism, right? So it's a sort of a purely mathematical thing. Here's the Markov chain, very simple, with 3 elements. And in general, such search algorithms, they use a host of these clustering mechanisms in a way that objects in the same group or a cluster or more similar in one sense or another group together according to various inputs, which have to do with popularity of the search result, the frequency to which it is linked and shared, the context, such as the text around the result, meta tagging, etc., which is information about the image or the search object provided by the page that the image is taken from, etc., etc., etc. That is kind of what is going on. Now, to call this bias is a very strange move. It is simply the way a Markov chain works, right? A one-state Markov model, for example, simply registers from a sequence of possible events or tokens in which the possibility of every event in that string depends on the state attained in the previous event. The whole thing gets reevaluated as a new event appears. This is simply 3 elements. If you ate pizza first, it's 0.7 chance you're going to eat hot dog next. If you eat pizza, and 0.3 that you eat a hamburger, etc. That's how the likelihoods are distributed. If you hot dog, the chances 50% you eat another hot dog or 50% hamburger. This is the kind of thing we are dealing with, right? And this is a very simple Markov model. So we tried a couple of search experiments about this in 2016 when we were all super freaked out. And so this one reads ARE, spacebar, and a spacebar is a positive token, right? It's a, I don't know, and a very common one, in fact, the most common one in all languages. Okay? Then WOME, right? R, woman. It will then do this thing where it cascades down and it's an auto-suggest. And I think we should keep the hypnotic element alive here with the idea of an irrational sort of suggestion that you take the bait on. And it guesses through a Markov chain complex, sort of n-grams and so on, that the next letter is N. Well, sure, highly likely, and it gives us N. But then it also gives us a little bit more, right? And here's where the statistical sort of reality kicks in. It's quite interesting. What it gives us is, are women evil? That is the first of the search engine sort of fallouts. This is 2016. We did the same thing with Blacks and Muslims and Jews and so on. Actually, Muslim and Jew, and then the S came, and that was all good. But the results were kind of startling. Jews was only evil, are Jews evil was only 4th, so they sort of lucked out a little bit in relation to women. But the first one was, are Jews a race, and so on. Blacks was pretty terrifying at the time, the dumbest race, not even are they a race, and so on. And this came up sort of unwittingly. Now, so we cannot turn to the engineers and say, yeah, you're too white, you're too male, cowboys, cyber cowboys, libertarian, because that is the wrong place to look, because this was an accurate reflection of a certain idiolect of typing. if you type strings of things, objects that way, this is likely that you'll be hanging out in a cluster of like-minded people, networked, not in a circle, that think that way. It's sort of very, very simple. And it's not 4chan or 8chan or some hidden like dark corner of the internet. It is right there on the surface. It is on the surface that you can network that. And why? It is highly unlikely that any of us in the room ever typed ARE spacebar WOME as if a gender or something like Jews could have anything like homogeneous characteristics that you can kind of sum up against something. That is the very definition of racism. But those who do think that way, or rather those who type strings in that way into a Markov kind of system, or n-grams, where bigrams and trigrams are evaluated, etc., will be then rewarded. I mean, so in other words, a little bit like if you threw a lemon into a cup of milk and it curdles like that, it finds that pattern over there. But it's definitely not of itself biased. What it is doing is far too objective. What you need is the librarian to come in and say, excuse me. Like if you walked into a library in Canada or in America and said, listen, I moved into a neighborhood, there's lots of Jews, I'm from Cameroon, who are they? Yeah, I want some good information, you know, I want to be neighborly. And they gave them anything like what Google gave you, the librarian would be fired. And in France, you would actually go to prison, right? You would go to prison for delivering what you are delivered through Google. Of course, they very quickly fixed this. You do this today, things are better because of these complaints that were then registered, right? So that was women, terrible. I call it a word war. That was blacks. And then the funny thing about 3 black teenagers, which went viral at one point. But I will spare you that for a second. And make a few general observations. I need to close up very, very soon, which is that I think what we've moved into, as we've moved out of a kind of old school of computing and AI and machine learning and so on, AI used to be something very different to what it is now. So the laws that guide AI that are built in the 1950s, from the 50s to the 80s, really are dealing with a completely different phenomenon to now. And one could sum it up by saying what used to be these sort of generative, symbolic, human readable systems, exhaustive kind of declarations of rules and procedures, coding in the old sense, if this, then that, all sorts of like symbolic structures, has now shifted. That's an older form that has now shifted into statistical correlation alone, right? That correlationism is in some sense the paradigm in which we live. And Jelinek was already onto this at the IBM Corporate Archives in the 1980s, that he thought that when we look to fly a plane, we don't want to be looking at birds. What we want to be looking at, in fact, is, you know, how computers can think this thing better than any like living form, better than humans and so on. So we have shifted into this correlational paradigm, or what I call massive correlation machines. And that in some sense takes us to these generative pre-trained transformers, which are kind of, in some sense, also statistical probabilities from gigabytes of training data, the GPTs, the BARD, Notion, AI, WordTune, Dolly, etc. All of these, where you predict out of a string of letters or group of letters that might, in some sense, have meaningful conceptualization, following certain rules and constraints, right? Structure, objects on the model of language, right? Or large language models. I will, these are the 2 primary techniques used, or not primary techniques, but how indicate a little bit of how this works. That you're relying in some sense on substitutions, which are these embeddings, and then bindings, which are appropriate ways that are modeled on the structure of language itself to give us, you know, a text that reads as if it were thinking in some sense intelligently. There are many critiques of this, you know, I mean, just looking at like Ted Chiang, who sees it as a kind of lossy compression problem, where hallucinations are by definition produced, even when it's deeply only mired in like truthful data, through a kind of paraphrase technique, which then is like a lossy compression, and you keep distancing yourself. This is Plato's old idea of incremental falsehood emerging through small adjustments, or, you know, Timnit Gebru, who talks about stochastic sequences of notation without references or stochastic parrots and so on. And then they call for what, they identify something called documentation debt, which is mean it's harder and harder to get to the documents that provide it. And as this becomes more opaque and black boxed and so on, which is already the case with the new generations of GPT, we have deeper and deeper problems in that sense. And then they did a lot of failures, and I just sort of had a few failures up there to show, which is heavier. I'll stop there. There are more potential arenas about thinking through these kind of technical phenomena, but I think that's enough for the context that we're dealing with now. So it's the law, it's the economy, and it's a certain way in which computing works on a technical level that have come together to create the conditions for the possibility of a sort of irreducible disinformation creep. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.